Our next speaker is Indy Johar, co founder of Project Zero Zero, a collaborative studio of architects, strategic designers, programmers, social scientists, economists, and urban designers practicing design beyond its traditional borders. And most recently, Dark Labs, a field laboratory focused on radically redesigning the bureaucratic and institutional infrastructure of our cities, regions, and towns for a more democratic, distinguished, or distributed great transition. His session is entitled Futuristic Designs and Strategic Leadership, where he will share his journey of change, learning, innovation, and desire to create positive impact, as well as the importance of having a design mindset to achieve these things. Everyone, let's welcome to the IDC 2021 stage, Indy Johar. Hi, Indy.
Hello, how are you?
I am good. Welcome
that was a big build up.
Pardon?
That was a big build up. I hope I don't disappoint.
No, not at all. I'm pretty sure that was just perfect for you. Welcome to the Philippine virtual stage. If we were not in the situation that we are in, you would literally be in the Philippines and on our stage. But please let our audience know, where are you streaming in from?
I'm streaming in from London actually today, so I'm delighted to be here. I know there's been a couple of opportunities to come over to the Philippines, so I look forward to that in the future. But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to contribute to this conversation.
We appreciate you spending your Friday morning with us, because I know it is morning on your end now. Before I turn over the stage to you, I would just like to once again remind our audience to comment their questions, ideas, opinions, or send them through our inbox so that our team can cue them later on for our fireside chat with Indy. I'll catch up with everyone later on, but for now, the virtual stage is all yours, Indy.
That's very kind. So I'm going to invite us to take a bit of a breath and go on a little journey with me. And I'm going to propose it to you that I come at this at a stage that I think we're facing one of the largest transitions in society that we've ever seen, probably in the last 400 years from a civilization perspective. And that transition is a structural transition. It's not just a transition of things, but it's a fundamental transition in how we see the world. And that has great implications for design and the leadership of design itself. So I want to start there. And I want to start by saying that actually our perception, our ideas of design have been constructed in a very particular age. Most of our ideas of design have been constructed through an idea of objects, subjects, perspectives, the objectification of the world. These things are ways that we have seen and organized the world. And I think some of those fundamentals are transitioning and transforming. So I'm going to take us down a little bit of a philosophical path, but to then bring us back into some reality. Just to give some context to this, Dartmouth Labs, we're a team of about now 55 people from around the world, from Vancouver to South Korea. We're a distributed network studio with near full-time people. And we are a team that looks at how do you build new institutions, how do you design and build new institutional qualities. And I'll explain a little bit about that later. And, literally from, as was being said, kind of data scientists to policy people to tech UX designers. So what we have talked about is design has to be at the synthesis of multiple capabilities. So more and more, one of the key things for me is how do you build a polymathic studio, a studio with polymathic capabilities, which I think are essential for 21st century design. We could talk about this in our Q&A questions after this. A little bit of my history, I've been part of building many things, fortunately, whether it's from building Architecture 00, which is an architectural organization based out in London, to OpenDesk, open source furniture company, to multiple impact hubs, and was one of the global directors in 2011, at the kind of design stage of the Impact Hub network, WikiHouse, open source housing, and of course Dartmouth Labs. So just to give a quality, I mean, we're part of building social action structures. So we have a history of building things. That's been largely my history, is that design and building new types of institutions and organizations. WikiHouse, open source housing, furniture. So the thing that became very clear to us as we were building many of these things was that underneath the world that we were building, the open source furniture or the housing, there were a whole bunch of structural questions which were undesigned or we felt were unconsidered. So in many parts of the world where we talk, everyone says there's a housing shortage and they talk about housing. And we end up building smaller and smaller housing. Architects do better and better job of building smaller and smaller housing. But actually the problem isn't housing. The problem is our organization of land and how land is organized. So one of the things we started to realize was that there was a kind of idea of the dark matter, the stuff that sits underneath the objects we make. So whether it's open source housing, it's not just about land, it's also about how do we financialize housing and the quality assurance mechanisms. So we can create these open source products. So we're really interested in how do you democratize our capability to build the city? How do you democratize that? But also behind that is an underlying thing, which is how do you build the institutional infrastructures? And I'm going to go into that, so I'll unpack this, so be patient with me on this. So, but I want to start in a kind of very particular way. I think that for design to be relevant, we need to re-embrace the scale of the challenge that we're in the middle of. And this goes back to the beginning of my conversation, which is that I think we're in a world-shifting moment. And too much of design is obsessed by, let's say, comforting the old. Whereas actually, if you look at where we're headed, we're almost likely headed to 2.7 to 3.2 degrees temperature change, which almost certainly in terms of global north, global south has massive implications. Now, if you marry that reality with the reality that 78% of S&P 100s would, I think, be unviable if they had to account for social and environmental costs. It means the products and the things we're making are fundamentally wrong, not tinkering wrong, not evolutionary wrong, but almost structurally wrong. Now, that means that our future products and things are made in a fundamentally different way. It means we're going to move from a material economy to an intangibles economy. The value of intangibles will become more critical. We're going to move from a waste economy to a biomaterial circular economy. We're going to almost certainly move from a circular economy only to actually also durable economies. How to build products which are deeply durable. What is an economy of a durable product in terms of repair, refit, all those things? And then we're also going to move to building actually a regenerative base layer of a naturally ecological economy, a nature-based regenerative base layer economy. And then also fundamentally, we have to start to think about a rare earth economy. So all of these economies are different and they interact in the world and they will create a whole new class of products and a whole new class of thinking. So it's worth, when we start to look at the transition of the future, to start to imagine what these things look like. Now, a durable economy can work in the idea of ownership to a degree, whereas actually a circular economy can't. It has to be actually, the materials almost have to be held independently from a traditional ownership economy. An intangibles economy can be lots about intangible ownership, NFTs and other things. So what you've got is, and a nature-based economy perhaps has to transcend the theory of ownership and be entreated with. So these economies have fundamentally different characteristics and thereby fundamentally different relationships to the world. And I think one of the things I sort of talk about more and more is that actually we are going to see this sort of scale of structural transition. And it's worth us recognizing the scale of what we're talking about. So 96% of mammals on Earth are livestock and humans. So 4% are wild animals. That's kind of elephants, zebras. That's 4%. So actually, the anthropological landscape is massive. Wild landscape is minimal increasingly. So we have to start to actually reconcile and understand the externalities that we're generating and the implications of that and reconsider those. And this has happened in a very short period of time. So if you look at what we've done since the 1970s, 60% of animal populations wiped out in the last 50 years. And I think that's still accelerating. At the same time, and as was being eloquently said by Kim, we're in a massive transformation of kind of, I would say, COVID has revealed things to us. The fragility of our existing system, supply chains around the world, actually accelerating systemic injustices between the rich and the poor. The rich were able to live in nice houses and gardens, and whereas other things that people that didn't have the capacity, actually the systemic injustices have been significant, both in terms of the impact on children, the impact on actually household violence, all sorts of things that happened. At the same time, we know that actually our global interdependence has become much more clearer. We cannot isolate, and although the West is trying to do this, but there's no way to isolate this problem to one location. Actually, we have to deal with it in an integrated way. But this requires a different type of global coordination that we've never been used to. And then it's about reconfiguring our relationship. The household, the nature of our house, nature of work has fundamentally changed. And I would posit that this is a herald, the beginning of a long age of emergencies. COVID is just the beginning, and climate change effects, which many of you know, whether it's in sort of food crops all the way through to heat effects, to storms, flooding, heat island effects in cities, all sorts of things that are going to be manifesting in significant ways. And these risks are cascading. So when we look at this world, these are cascading risks. And why I bring this up is that only when we start to understand these cascading risks, we understand how we have to change and the scale of change that's on the table. So, you know, the stress that's being caused has been cascading all the way down to how we live our lives and how we operationalize ourselves. And many people are saying, you know, we're going to go back to the office. Maybe, maybe not. Maybe we're going to go back to the office one day a week, and that's all that's going to happen. And that's okay. But in order for that to be okay, our cities have to be fit for purpose. So the question is, are we seeing a more fundamental shift in our theory of how we organize, value our economic geography? And this goes back to my previous point about intangible economies. So I think one of the big things we're going to see is the growth of intangible assets. Intangible assets are like networks. The goodwill of your brand is an intangible asset. The goodwill or the trust or the participation in a collective design process, that's an intangible asset. And what we're seeing is intangible assets growing as their share of value. And as designers, I think we have to talk more and more about how we work with intangible assets rather than just tangible assets. Intangible assets of a startup, for example, a tech startup, can be nearly 80% of the value of that organization. So as designers, what's our role in understanding these intangible assets and really materializing them becomes very, very clear. At the same time, I think we have to start to understand, and this is for the architects and urbanists around us, is that for all the want of other things that we talk about in terms of DeFi, distributed finance, various other things, land is becoming a mechanism to extract value in an intangible world. So as the assets become more and more intangible, land is the mechanism to extract value or hold value. So wealth economy is increasingly linked to land, and land reform is going to be critical as part of that. At the same time, we're seeing a massive transformation, or we're about to see a massive transformation in automation and things. Automation is going to transform us. Now, it can be a source of threat, i.e. the destruction of jobs, or it can be a source of liberation. It's a source of liberation if we can do the human investment to actually build a new human economy. 21st century cities, in our view, are going to be less and less about numbers of people growing, not going from 10 million to 15 million. It's going to be about how 10 million people become more effective. You unlock the collective intelligence of 10 million people. You unlock the collective welfare of 10 million people, their thriving, their mental health. These intangibles are actually the real asset of the 21st century, and they're collective assets, not individual assets. So how do you create the conditions for this new 21st century economy? That means the role of physical design of cities is less about shiny towers. It's actually about our ability to unlock these intangible assets, this kind of thriving growth model, as opposed to the material growth model. And that sits in the context of these things. And I think this is where, as designers, we have to recognize our role is to design at a systemic level, whether it's actually nutrition decline, entrenching quality, labor market automation. These things are transforming everything around us, and they will do increasingly with shocks. We know that as a result of climate change, we're going to see something in the region of about 26% loss, or up to 20% loss in nutrition value in global south. So what does that do to actually how we start to think about the future of food is going to be one of the biggest interesting and transformative issues that we've got on our table. And I want to put this in context that I think these things are already happening. So it has been posited that Syria as a crisis was one of the first crises of climate change where actually farmers could not farm on their land and thereby had to go to urban environments, and that destabilized many of the things around us. So we're going to see large-scale transitions. And what's the role of designers in that future become really clear. The cause and effects of these things are non-linear. The crises have cascading crises. The Syrian crisis didn't go from rural to urban, it went to rural to urban to international. And the implications are still being felt. And there's no single simplistic villain. Actually, this is a key issue. There's no single simplistic villain. There's no single simplistic intervention in that theory. So what does change look like in a complex world when actually the problems are non-linear? The problem of fixing housing supply is not just actually about smaller housing. Actually, it requires us to look at the system of intervention. What is the role of designers when we look at those system interventions? This is a portfolio of obesity impacts. So when you look at the system of kind of all the drivers of obesity, you realize that obesity cannot be resolved by one intervention. How do we drive change in that future? And the system is not flat. It cascades. It has a topography of effects. How do we start to operate in that way? And it's also evident that actually we are generating risks for future citizens, and actually the future not only are we generating risks for future generations, terminating them, and actually there are risks present that are manifest of the future as well. So we have to look at risk in a symmetrical sense. And I think that's a really key thing. And I think unless we start to understand the implications we're creating for future generations, it becomes very, very, very difficult to move forward. So when we start to look at this, I think one of the roles of designers is to start to talk about these large-scale transitions. So when we talk about a historic model, our current economy is, we perceive the human as an economic agent, homo economos. You're incentivized by external incentives, more money, more reward, whatever. Now that is a model which relies on extrinsic incentives, i.e. incentives outside you. That means that actually markets are effectively giving you reward, and that's the incentive for you to do something. So you're instrumentalized by external actors. Now, in order to make that possible, there is a theory to say that in order to make that economy possible, you have to make people precarious. So the more precarious they are, the more easy it is for them to be externally organized by what jobs there are out there, right? And that's constructed our theory of labor, that's constructed our theory of education, that's constructed many of the logics. Now, in the 21st century, one of the big challenges is that our extrinsic organization is great for procedural work. It's great when you know what you want someone to do, you tell them what you want them to do, and they do it, right? It's a kind of procedural work. But if you move into a kind of a theory of work, which is about care, craft, creativity, cognition, complexity, that isn't extrinsically motivated. That's actually intrinsically motivated and intrinsically designed. So how do we create the landscape, the foundations for a new economic reality, which isn't about extrinsic motivation? How do we create these social infrastructures for that new economy? I think will be one of the big things. So when we start to talk about design here becomes actually our capacity to actually create new relationships between incentives, economics, and institutional landscapes. How do we operationalize those things? How do we build in uncertainty? And it's clear that when we look into these futures, what becomes clear is that we can respond to known crises, respond to crises that are knowable. We can build capacities to actually deal with crises that are likely. And then there is a question about how we build the capacity to deal with unknown risks. And these are fundamentally different types of things, right? Now, how do we build that foundational capacity? How do we build the capacity for society to actually sense make these civic risks? How do you build the capacity to actually build legitimacy about the sense making and understanding? And how do you build a devolution of response and solutioneering in a complex system? Because this isn't about centrally imposed ideas, it is about how a system responds in multidimensional failures. Now, that requires us to understand something structural, that actually some of the deep root problems in looking at complex problems that I think we're facing and complex design challenges is that actually the root problems are about this, that we've siloed our decision-making capacity. So that so for example, preventative impacts of healthcare are not really in the hands of the health department. They're actually in the hands of all sorts of transportation departments and other departments. So how do we start to think about decision-making capacity? The instrumentalization of actually centralized simple solutions rather than actually building the capacity. The lack of accountability mechanisms. Our incentive systems are badly designed to actually create perverse outcomes. And the lack of adequate representation, both of future generations, but also non-human systems. So short-termism in our framework, all these things become really clear, and the lack of shared languages. So when we start to look in this future, the creation, what we're seeing is a creation of runaway causal loops. And I would argue that climate change is a symptom of a failure of our failure to govern ourselves. And that's generating externalities, which are now feedbacking on itself. So if we're going to talk about design, and design increasingly from our perspective is operating not just at the physical object level, but actually diagonally across this into supply chains, into sort of new theories of governance. So we call these system demonstrators. How do you reimagine a product, but also reimagine it into the system that exists in order to be able to scale the level of effect? And it's about us recognizing these system demonstrators across multiple agents. This is a collaborative process. It requires us to work diagonally all the way through these things. And that's why our teams are multidimensional teams. And it requires us to understand that we're responding to molecular, non-linear, invisible, and micro threats, right? Whereas our governance systems are not designed around that. And these deep code design issues are really structural. So whereas our symptoms are all sorts of chronic illness, loneliness, heat-island effects, underlying issues are much more structural. They're, for example, trees. A tree is seen as an urban tree is seen as a liability in terms of maintenance and insurance costs. So actually, unless you reimagine understanding the value of an urban tree on the balance sheet of government, the trees don't exist. We can keep drawing them, but we are drawing the wrong thing without understanding those systemic issues. And this requires portfolio-based responses. This requires innovation at multiple teams working together to drive an outcome of change. And underneath it are all sorts of issues that need to be sitting together. How we procure property rights, reimagining property rights, reimagining company structures, accounting systems. Thermodynamic accounting changes how we build, what we imagine, what we conserve. And also our theory of social norms, the social memetics to which we operate. So it is in this context that I think we can start to see what I would talk about as a boring revolution. How do we start to imagine it? I'm going to start to speed up a little bit in cognition of time. Many of you will recognize this as the High Line in New York. But one of the interesting things is we did the work around the High Line, where we looked at the land value uplift attributable to the High Line. And what we found out was that you could have paid for the High Line in under 10 months if you just took 10% of the land value uplift and shared it. So we started to talk about how do you build the smart covenant in that framework? How do you build that contract which actually allows for the sharing of that land value uplift? Now that covenant means you can pay for civic goods in new ways. So we create a new economy, a civic economy of many, where the benefits that are attributed are shared back to create new economies. So increasingly the work that we're doing is looking at this civic infrastructure and new ways of actually building the many value models behind it, because we think that's the underlying issue to be able to build many of these things. And that looks at all the issues of tokenization and unbundling of property rights in smart ways, and how do you start to unbundle them for new forms of value, and how that materially starts to change the nature of design, how that recognizes the impact of poor housing on healthcare in the UK. So the value of the house is not the tradable value of the house. It's also the spillover value in terms of healthcare costs, education costs if it's overcrowded, all the way through to supply chain costs, maintenance value. So when you look at the house through this systems level value, you start to perceive it in a completely different way, and the economy of the house is transformed. And again, we're seeing this system level approach all the way to $1 million blocks. So, which was done in Chicago, where they looked at the reoffending rates of urban blocks. So actually the cost to state as a result of reoffending and what were the $1 million blocks. And they took those $1 million in terms of reoffending rates and the cost and the penal system of people going to jail and reinvested them in actually supporting urban renewal and supporting people getting their lives back. So how do we start to shift this idea of real estate and real value all the way from the design cost, which is 0.1, but the total cost emission can be something like 80 times that, excluding the local multiplier. So this starts to reframe the theory of design and its leverage, not in the product, but the outcomes and the effects that it generates. Next, it's really important we change our relationship. There's a talk I'm doing later today on actually reimagining our relationship with the world. And more, we have to recognize most of our governance models and how we design things are based around actually rule-based systems. How do we start to talk about machine rule systems? What does that open up? New ways of thinking, machine-to-machine systems and machine-to-ecological systems. What do these futures of governance models open up in terms of new ways of unlocking? We're doing work in Daegu City right now in South Korea, which is looking at how do you create the permissioning landscape of public realm. So a digital permissioning landscape where you can effectively, if you want to be an on-street vendor, you can actually real-time ask to be an on-street vendor on a digital platform application that you are. And that creates a whole new economy of actually how you use public realm, but also govern ourselves in really smart ways. And this allows us to start to think of governance in a fundamentally different way. Our current theories of governance are loosely bounded. How do we start to think? And the technology is increasingly tightly bounded. So if you take your car and you drive it down a street, it's very near. I think within the next 3 years, there are laws going into play which say the car won't be able to drive more than the speed limit. It physically won't be able to drive. It's got digital limiters on it. Now, is that a good way? Is that the way we want to do centralized control? Or do we want to create an ennobling architecture? We know with many AI, machine-assisted learning capacities, actually ennobling, helping people make better decisions is a better route of control. So there's a really fundamental question about how we govern and interact in the world that's going to be asked in this format. And that has implications for lots of things around licensing, governance, of how we govern our cities, how we coexist. And at the same time, this goes all the way through to the products that we make. This is WikiHouse and what we've been doing with the WikiHouse to how do we start to create, we're designing a self-sovereign house, a house that owns itself. How do you start to organize that? What are the frameworks to be able to do that? And that invites us to think about these things in a fundamentally different way and organize these values. How do you start to think about from competition to non-rivals economics? A forest and the value of a forest cannot be deemed through competition. It must be understood in relationship with you either. This has fundamental implications of how we see common goods and common assets and the values they generate and the values they create and contribute. How do we start to price them and understand that? That again is critical. So what you're seeing from us is that we're not seeing design as an object design. We're seeing design as a thesis goes between the object design, the contract, and the financing, and sees it as an ecological system that sits across that. And that goes beyond all of these things into new forms of actually governance instruments at a structural level. And all of this stuff requires portfolios of change, portfolios of multiple interventions. Now, I'm going to give you an example that what the role of time dimension is really critical. So what's really clear is that most of our, say, health outcomes are focused on failure to treat, i.e. not doing any treatment, the cost of treatment. The cost of prevention is less than 2%, but prevention requires systemic intervention. And thriving is the unlocking of actually 20 or 30 years more life and good quality life, the impact of thriving. Now, every one of these interventions has a different scale of intervention, a different economy, and a different governance model. So as designers, we often live in the treatment world. Prevention is very difficult to deliver. We draw it often, but it's very difficult to deliver because we don't have the economics and the governance mechanisms around that. And thriving is virtually never imagined. So if we want to start to create these futures, we have to start to expand the theory of design to actually operate across that and build these sort of radical portfolios all the way through. So many of what I said there is actually making an advocacy. I'm advocating that actually as designers, we need to start to think about the boring dimensions around our world. So the future of how we license things, the future of how we contract between things, the future of how we construct policy, the future of rights. These things are coming together to transform how we are. But I think all of this stuff sits at one fundamental position, which is, I would say, is a 21st century human condition, reimagining who we are. Every time design and art has started to look at the future, it has started to look at the future by actually reimagining who we are as individuals. And what I propose it to you is that we are they. I am a plurality. You are a plurality. We are they. I am a biological multitude. I have multiple contextual identities. I am a confluence of a fluidity of identities and personalities. At a quantum material level, I am fully entangled. At a brain, I am entangled with all my networks around me. It is not my brain, but actually a social brain. Now, when you start to look at the world through understanding yourself in this way, you start to have a paradigm question about how we exist. In terms of epigenetics, we know that actually the impacts of poverty and famine are seen 2 generations down the line as a result of its impacts on epigenetics. We know even scarcity, so financial scarcity, deteriorates IQ and mental decision-making capacity. We know we're a biological multitude. Your gut, what the food that you're eating affects your mood and even your cognitive capabilities. We know long-term emotional scars have inheritable genetic changes to you. So what is the violence that we're producing? We know this molecular violence exists all the way through to our cortisone levels and actually has significant effects on our long-term capabilities in terms of our life rates. So when we start to understand ourselves through these lenses, it becomes clear that a deeper change is required. And this is where I say that the deeper change for me is going beyond the world conversations that we're having. The science and the policy of reimagining ourselves invites us to reimagine ourselves in different ways. And I'm coming to an end. I suppose what I want to put down on the table here as designers is I think we're fundamentally at a transition space between who we are and how we imagine ourselves. And the science of that is already there, but it also means that our relationship with things around us, so I would argue that ownership is just an extension of servitude, and it's an old world idea. We have to be in stewardship with things. We have to be in treaty with things. And increasingly, that relationship is going to be transformed. Employment contracts largely are contracts of servitude. They aren't contracts of collaboration. Actually, we spend most of our time not being able to say what we want to say, because that's what employment does. These are old models of control, old models of actually ownership. Our relationship with the future is that one of, again, control. But we do not have a thesis for long-termism. We don't have a mechanism of actually thinking longitudinally, intergenerationally. At the same time, I think we're in an age of discovery. So I think what I want to say is that I think if we recognize the depth of transformation that we're seeing in ourselves and who we are, because we're not singular objects, we're interdependent, we're fully interdependent with the world around us. We have to recognize and reimagine our relationship to the world. It cannot be about solitude, but must be about being in treaty with, both with the present and the future, both with humans and non-humans. That requires a foundational transition. And that opens up all the way through our theory of human development, all our theory of health, increasingly a series of One Health, all the way through to actually looking at our relationship with the future. Persistent cells, how do we persist into the future? What is our relationship with the future? All the way to persistent things. What if a thing desires to persist? How do we create democracies that are able to look at the long term? How do we recognize, instead of organizations being abstracted and isolated from the world, as private limited companies are, but we recognize our entanglement? How do we operate into those things? These are fundamental questions that I think will change the nature of design. It changes our nature with trees around us. We recognize trees as a liability. We do not understand all their societal benefits, which are heat effects, sustainable urban drainage, carbon dioxide, microbiomes, all sorts of secondary effects, which are unvalued in our economy because we don't perceive them in a complete way. And our theories of property all the way through to actually some of the deep transitions. So as I come to an end, I suppose my invitation to us all is that I think design is changing, but what is fundamentally changing is our relationship with the world and our relationship with the future, our relationship with nature, our relationship with humans, our relationship with things. Things will become self-sovereign. Nature, there's many projects going on around the world where rivers are becoming self-sovereign. I think our future has to be not colonized, but actually be able to work with. We cannot be terminating future generations. This is a new redefinition of our relationship with the world. And in that, design changes. Everything changes by design as well. And we have to address our legacy lock-ins, our perception of self, and how we perceive ourselves, and how we construct the perception of self consistently in design. How we design our organizations for intrinsic motivation as opposed to extrinsic incentives. How do we reimagine our deep code structures like property rights, employment laws in really radical forms? And how do we free ourselves from the lock-ins to these realities becomes really critical. So with that, I'm going to end, but thank you all for listening, and hopefully we can have a few questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that session, Indy. That was quite a lot to take in. Thank you for spending time. Now, we are giving you a bit of time to catch your breath, maybe have a drink of water before your fireside chat. Like you said, you're looking forward to the questions. Lai will take care of that. But for now, I will give you a little bit of a break. Is that okay?
Thank you.
All right. But we will be checking in with you again a few minutes from now. For now, I did promise to talk about our poll. So let us do that, shall we? Earlier, we asked you a poll question. And the poll question is, what are people spending more money and time on? Again, that was, what are people spending more money and time on? Plants, healthy food, C, a space makeover, or D, Netflix? So we already have the results. Let's show it, team. What did we get? What do we have? So, nobody spent money on plants. It was only me. Well, too bad I didn't get to answer the poll. So, evidently, a majority are spending on healthy food, 55%, a little more than half. And then space makeovers at 36%, and Netflix with 9%. All right. So I guess I'm the only plantita who is joining us at the event right now. Thank you very much for sending that in. Back to our program and on to our fireside chat. We will be joined by the head arts and creative industries, Philippines and Southeast Asia creative hubs for good program interim lead for British Council or of the British Council. She will be engaging in this conversation with Indy and discuss some of the questions that you've sent over in our inbox and comments. Please welcome Lai Del Rosario.
Hello. Hi, Indy. Good morning and good evening to everyone watching from the Philippines. I'm Lai. My name is Lai, and I'm very happy to be interviewing Indy for this conference. And thank you, by the way, to our partners at the Design Center of the Philippines for bringing us in to their program. Indy, I just wanted to, I guess, kind of have my summarized take on your presentation, because there was a lot to unpack there, and over a very short period of time. So yeah, okay. The first, I think that, what I got from the presentation is, the changing role of designers in society, right? And also the changing role of the way designers should be seeing their relationship with the world. Um, and I think I have some follow up questions on that. And I think we can go over the questions based on the key points that I think I got from you. The second is how our economies are producing the wrong things, or basically how economies are producing things that are failing the earth, and thus we have things like climate change. The third is the importance of governance to redesign these systems, right? And then the last that I got is the need to embrace interdependencies. to see interdependencies as ways to kind of work together, to force us to work together almost, and not as bureaucracy, and not as something that will slow things down. And of course, the need to embrace our interdependencies with nature, um, and to create deep change, right? So I guess to go back a little bit, you mentioned that you're an architect by training, and we have a lot of people watching here who are also probably architects, young designers. I just wanted to ask you how your training as an architect influence your perspectives now and your work now.
Fundamentally, I think for me, the big thing about being a designer or an architect is that I think you're trained to be propositional. You're trained to not only analyze things, but to propose things in bleak ways. So I think designers are trained to synthesize across multiple disciplines and multiple contexts. And that I think is a unique contribution that designers can make in a way that actually is really powerful. And I think one of the things that I learned very quickly was that as an architect, you work across multiple materials, legal frameworks, policy frameworks to design things. And the reality is that we work as systems. We work across these systems to create synthesis of a knot of value. And where that knot includes finance and other things it's just an idea of how we do stuff. I mean, I was fortunate that we ended up doing, we built the Bristol Urban Beach with Melissa Mean. We built things. We were part of building impact hubs. So not just as designers, but actually as entrepreneurs. So I think design entrepreneurship becomes a really critical manifestation point in an age of complexity. I think one of the biggest challenges for designers right now is that in an age of complexity, there's no one procuring these things. No one goes there and goes, I would like this degree of uncertainty. So actually, one of the key things for designers, right, is to be co-entrepreneurs with our partners. So we have to go from being consultants to be co-entrepreneurs in these sort of problems. So that's been really the journey for me, is actually the kind of co-entrepreneurship aspect, but also fundamentally actually recognizing as designers we synthesize across complex systems. And that's a key thing. So as a designer, the other aspect of it is to think philosophically. I think most of the 21st century in this age is going to be about philosopher makers. How do you philosophize and understand new ways of seeing something and able to construct new ways of making it? And that is really critical.
Yeah. How do you think the role or architects and designers are changing right now? Are they changing in your view?
In my view, they're changing significantly. But on one hand, I think design is becoming, I think it's really where you are. Design is becoming marginal on one side, it's becoming packaging, synthetic, outside. And in other places, it's becoming deep. And I think that we're seeing this bifurcation of design. So, and whereas the demand for what I would call systems design or working at the edge of complexity is massively growing. We as a team have more than doubled over COVID. So the kind of demand, and it's not, it's working all the way from, like I say, from South Korea to Vancouver, literally all over. So the demand for this is growing in really radical ways. But I think it does require new competencies. And it isn't about just designers, it's about sort of what I'd call a design studio, which means that you need more polymathic capabilities in that studio in a way that we've never seen. So a whole team of architects can't do this work.
Yeah. You also talked about, the profitability of big companies, that they're only profitable because they're not spending enough on the things that matter or that are meant to sustain the earth, right?
So no, I was being more fundamental than that. I think most of the things that they're creating aren't viable. Like as
the things that they're creating.
Most of the things that we have around us are just not viable. That's in, if you were to price through cost, and we will eventually have to price that through cost, unless we terminate ourselves as a civilization. The price of carbon, I think the price of carbon per ton, if it is not amortized, if you don't put a depreciation rate on it, is effectively something like $27,000. It's massive. So if you look at the true liabilities of a ton of carbon and what the impacts are, it's massive. So I think we're not pricing these things in yet. Currently we're at sort of 25, 27 euros a ton. Some people are talking about 100. Some people are talking about carbon capture at 500. When you start to price these things in, our economy fundamentally changes. The goods that we have around us fundamentally change. The shoes that we have fundamentally change. And it isn't a small thing, it's a fundamental thing about how the cost of logistics will change most of our food products. All sorts of things will be transformed. And food prices, for example, will more than double most likely. Historically, food has almost been 20% of a person's salary. Actually, we've seen it go down to about 9 to 10% in the Western world. And we'll see it double, if not more. So we're already seeing food price fluctuations around the world, and our predicted energy price fluctuations are massively happening. So we're in the middle of a bit of a transition with structural implications.
Yeah. You talked about, how we need to transition from a tangible economy to an intangible economy. What does an intangible economy look like? And how do you think that will affect the design sector, or the role of designers, or what they should be creating?
Well, yes, I think the intangible economy is significant. I mean, obviously, you would say, all the stuff that we're seeing on the digital landscape, but I also think it's about, the value of co-designing something that's part of an intangible asset. So it's not even the physical product, the social process of construction and design has massive value. So I think, the role of care in society, the role of human functions will become more and more valuable. So we're going to shift actually the production of value to more and more of those intangibles. You would argue, if you go to a very good coffee shop in anywhere, you can pay £3.50 in London for a coffee, right? But the reality is that coffee is probably costing 20 pence. So the other £3.20 is all about the craft of making that coffee there, in particular, in person. So that the value, most of the value of that product is not material cost of coffee, which is cheap still. And it may not be cheap in the future, but currently it still is. So this is actually layering on that as intangibles becomes really critical. And I think we're going to see the revaluing of intangibles around our products as a key thing. So it won't just be about pure intangibles, but the intangible value around the products that we create becoming more and more valuable, the products and the material economy shrinking. We have to shrink the material economy whilst we grow the intangibles economy.
That's really interesting. And I think, coming from, when we're talking about a country like the Philippines, where, it's, there's still a lot of product-based, economies. And it suggests a different way of valuing one's work, right? That you actually value the knowledge, ideas, intangible culture. So yeah, would you care to add some more?
And the social experience and the participation and the kind of emotional relationship, all these intangibles become really valuable. And I think increasingly that's going to be a key part of the story of how we make things.
Yeah. All right. Okay. I want to go to climate change because a lot of your presentation was really about kind of illustrating how economies are impacting the earth. And I remembered another speaker that we had at another event called Cameron Tonkin Weiss. He was talking about climate change as either a problem that's too big, meaning that it's too big a problem. We have no control. We have no power to change anything. Or a problem that's too small, meaning whatever we do, it will be irrelevant, right? So where do you think we should start when we talk about creating deep change? And of course, like responding to climate change.
I think the problem of climate change is actually a problem of how we see ourselves in the world. I think we have separated ourselves from the world. We have a relationship with the world. We perceive things through the theory of ownership and abstraction. I think if you were to really ask me, I think the biggest transformation to address climate change is a transformation of how we imagine ourselves. And we have to imagine ourselves in space and time in different ways. I think we've reduced ourselves to individual objects. Our names, our whole things, our identity systems, all constructed around our individuality. And that's the aspirational goal, rather than recognizing our interdependence. Our theory of everything is a theory of violence. So when you objectify things, when you move things apart and you make them distant, that objectification creates the permission of violence, creates the permission landscape for not caring. So how do we start to reframe and rebuild or reimagine and augmented? I don't think this is going backwards. How do we build an augmented sense of self and a transformative sense of self? I think it's one of the structural projects. At the same time, I think there's also recognition of actually how we recognize that the planet itself is now becoming conscious. So whilst there is us and our interdependence, I think you could argue that the planet itself is becoming conscious in an act of interdependence. So the planet is conscious of the CO2 increase, is now starting to actually transform it. So we are part of the planet being conscious. Machine, human, ecological systems becoming a new type of self-awareness. And that is a beautiful thing. If you look at it through that sense, the planet, we've been able to use satellite data to be able to understand the CO2 implications. We're then being able to transform ourselves in that process. So I think I agree with that. I agree with the kind of idea that this is both big and small, but I think the big and small is very particular. I think it's about ourselves, our idea of the planet and its relationship, and between that is our social imaginaries. It's all these instruments of ownership. It's all these instruments of how we understand money, employment laws. All these things are abstract, object-creating relationships, and I think we have to transfer them to be able to deal with climate change. And I think that this will happen to us whether we like it or not, is the other reality. I think the scale of risks, we are being made aware of our feedback. This is feedback happening to make us intelligent. All the risks.
Yeah. What do you think is the role of young designers, young entrepreneurs in this shift in thinking and in transitioning?
I think the role of young designers is to be expansive and disruptive. I mean, I think one of the things I really, I was in an architectural education meeting and somebody said, "Oh, we need young designers to be more fit for purpose for our architectural practice. They need to know more about how they can work in architectural practice." I'm like, that's bollocks. I don't want them to know more how to work with me. I want them to disrupt me. They have to be the source of actually a transformation of architectural practices now. They have to be a source of disruption. And I think that's really critical. What I would do is I think the footsteps, well, to be really ruthless, I would say design is in such an interesting space. I think it's in the middle of an intellectual vacuum. There is no real architectural theory. There is no, if you want to really understand buildings, you don't go to architects, you go to sort of behavioral economists and other people. I think there's such a great moment for a next generation of designers to really go after how we see the world. And I think that's transforming at a philosophical level all the way towards how we make it. So I think it's a great opportunity for young designers to really challenge everything we see. And I don't think we should be accepting our theories of cities and rural systems. Now, all these languages are broken. They're not fit for purpose. So I think there's a new taxonomy required, a new way to describe and imagine the world required. And that, I think, is really critical for young designers to challenge.
Yeah. Okay, that sounds very hopeful. I want to go now to governance. You talked a lot about governance, right?
Sure.
Yeah, actually, the way you're kind of presenting how we should be redesigning governance, it reminds me a little bit of kind of like the middleman system. I'm putting it, I guess, in the Philippine context. That a lot of craft communities and artisans rely on, in the sense that they need to rely on a middleman or a middle person, to govern their craft enterprise or their craft activity. And in most cases, they are seen as, kind of suspicious. They're not very well trusted, right? Um, and your suggestion, I guess, is not to kind of get rid of governance, right? But to create better governance. And again, to compare that to the craft context, I read somewhere that we should not get rid of middlemen. We should instead work with enlightened middlemen or middle people. Um, so that was very interesting in the sense that we need governance to stay in order to create this change. But on the other hand, for me, a lot of governance also relies on trust, right? So how do you think we can rebuild this trust, with our government or with things that govern us? And again, what is the role of designers in rebuilding this trust?
So I think the 21st century is not a middle man or even a middle woman. It's actually middle, sort of almost middle autonomous systems. I think the idea of how we can construct contingent machined protocols acting in the middle, I think is going to be really, really critical. So the birth of smart contracts is what I would call is smart intermediaries, smart middle things starting to happen between multiple agents. So I think I think there's been a lot of talk about the disintermediation of the middle, the removal of the middle. I don't think we're going to remove the middle, but I think what we're going to do is reimagine it using machine systems and autonomous machine systems. And I think that's going to be a key part of the transition into. And the question is, what is the role of these middle systems? Is the role to control, or is the role to ennoble? That's a design problem. So if we have a control theory, then these things are about controlling the supply chain through a vertical idea. Whereas actually you can have ennoblement systems which are about providing rapid feedback and distributive innovation capacity in a system with fundamentally different middle agents. So those middle autonomous agents can be fundamentally designed differently. And I think we have to be thinking about that in really radical formats. And that can be as simple as like the planning legislation is acting as a middleman between actually what we want to design and what the future needs are. And how do we start to reimagine those autonomous agents will be really smart. So I think we'll start from simple things like contracts and making them contingent and making them parametric, and that will reimagine that middle space to become better and better and more interesting in that format. But you're absolutely right to say there's something interesting going on in that middle space. That is what I think there's going to be a lot of imagination around.
Yeah, there's something interesting in the middle space. That's true. I guess I have just one last question for you, Indy. I represent the British Council, which is a cultural relations organization, and we're talking a lot about the need to work together, the need to collaborate, but also the fact that there is still such a big disparity between the global north and the global south. Which means that we're coming from very different contexts. We may have very different needs. So, how should the global north be working with the global south, do you think, to make change happen?
There's so many different ways of looking at that question. So I think we need to be really, the scale of impact of climate change will be brutally more felt in the global south than it will be in the global north. So if you look at the numbers, it's extraordinary. Then I think if you look at the strategic risks in terms of what those implications are, the need for transformation is in many ways is massive in the global south. But if you look at where the liabilities were created, it's massively driven by the global north. Right. So the global north has created lots of liabilities. The effects are going to be felt by the global south. And I think this requires a new type of global relationship. And my big thing is that actually we have to start to recognize our interdependence. I think the UK, from my perspective, should be perceiving itself as a system and should be recognizing itself as part of a metabolic system around the world and having different types of relationships, strategic enablement relationships, building that metabolic idea of how we support global supply chains, global value chains in different formats. And that requires longitudinal investment into that process. So I think we have to start to look more longitudinally. The fourth dimension I would say is I also think that certainly to other parts of the world, I think, it's worth recognizing how hardwired lifestyles, carbon systems are in the global north. And there is there is an opportunity to leapfrog those hardwired positions into new ways of living. And I think that's one of the key innovation spaces. New markets and new ideas of being are going to be born, I think, in the global south. They're not going to be born in the global north, which is desperately in a desire to preserve what it thinks is valuable without recognizing the systemic fall away that we're seeing. So I think, for me, it's as much about places like the UK learning new ways of being from Philippines and other places as it is anywhere else. So I think there's a degree of solidarity, there's a degree of recognizing ourselves as interdependent, there's creating new innovation pathways and working collaboratively on those, looking at new lifestyles and what's possible, building new kind of what I'd call sustainable supply chains in all those formats, but also recognizing there is a deep interdependence of where those liabilities have come from and how do we support each other to be able to make those transitions. So I think it's all these things. I'm sorry, it's a bit of a rich political answer, but I do think this is a political question in a way, and it requires us to be able to respond in a deep way and with some degree of integrity around that. But I also think these need to be pathways of collective innovation. One of the things I think that is really, really critical. Some of the work that's going on in places like South Korea, Vietnam, is far in excess of maybe what's going on in the UK. So I think there's opportunities of kind of reimagining that. Some of the kind of food supply chain issues that are emerging in Philippines, for example, we're doing some work out there on food systems. Well, there's going to be some really big issues emerging very quickly. And that might be a place of great leadership for Philippines to be able to reimagine its global food systems and look at how it builds biodiversity, embraces the biodiversity of its food system rather than actually narrow it down, which many of the Western systems have already done. So what does that mean of how do you build biodiverse food systems and the integrity that they build and the nutrition density that they build and the value that they construct? So I think there's innovation spaces that are possible in the Philippines that just aren't possible anywhere in other places in the world, and we need to embrace that.
Yeah. Well, it's been a pleasure, Indy. There was a lot to unpack with such limited time, but your answers will be well taken note of. So thank you very much. It's been a great discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Have a good rest of the day.
Okay, don't go anywhere yet. Please just stay put for a few more seconds. It was an absolute pleasure listening to your conversation. And the good thing about this being on Facebook is that we can always go back and relearn, re-listen to everything that Indy and Lai discussed just now. Can we ask you to stay for a moment so we can have a photo op? We would like to invite, as always, Design Center Executive Director, Ms. Ria Matute, to please join us for this photo.
Hi, Lai. Hi, Indy. I'm such a big fan of Indy, so I'm so happy to have you here.
Me too,
Next
actually.
time we'll get here, no? Physically in the Philippines.
I will definitely. I'll come. You have it on recording now.
Yes.
All right, thank you so much. Like, hold on, pose and give us your best smiles, and let's have this photo. Thank you very much. Again, thank you, Indy Johar and Miss Lai del Rosario. And thank you, of course, to Miss Ria Matute. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.